Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Heidi.
I'm Robin.
And today we'll be discussing Chapter 4, The Body. So before we get into today's episode, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the passing of Chadwick Boseman. I'm not sure when this episode is going to go live, as it were, but today is Sunday, August the 30th, and we found out about his passing just this last Friday. There's both so much to say and almost nothing at all to say, just because it's such a horrible, horrible thing to happen in a horrible, horrible year. And I know what T'Challa meant to me as an audience member, you know, what he represented, and I cannot imagine what his passing means to Black fans of Black Panther and to Black children who were able to see themselves in T'Challa, often for the first time. And he was just such an incredible artist and such an incredible person. And knowing what we know now, that he was sick and grappling with his diagnosis through the filming of so many of his biggest works, is astonishing and heartbreaking. And I feel very privileged to have experienced his work. I'm just heartbroken. And I just want to say that if anyone who is out there listening is having a tough time dealing with grieving his passing, you're not alone. It's not weird. It's perfectly normal. And don't be afraid to reach out and talk about it, because it's important and your grief matters.
Absolutely.
It's just so sad, and he should have had more time, and it's not fair, and it's not fair to him, and it's not fair to the people who looked up to him, and it's not fair to the children who idolized Black Panther. I mean, I cannot imagine having to tell my child that the man who played Black Panther has died. I can't imagine that. But I do think that he was not only an extraordinary artist, but an extraordinary person. And many, many people have said that. But just like, he understood what T'Challa meant to people, you know, especially to Black people. And as much as everyone believed in him, he believed in them too.
Mm-hmm. This is the episode where a lot of the first major shifts happen to set the rest in motion. This is where you get the first initial steps in new allegiances and new team ups. So for that reason, we're going to tackle this one in chronological order. This one has a lot of effective cutting and effective structure that I think warrant some highlighting, because it's a lot more obvious in future episodes. But this is the one where we're starting to see things click together.
You know, for a show that's very much focused on the supernatural, like, we as an audience member through dramatic irony know that there are supernatural goings on throughout the entire show. The entire series opens with the Demogorgon eating that unfortunate lab guy.
Yeah.
But this is the episode where so many other people begin to really grapple with the fact that it's not a bear, not a guy in a mask, that this is, in title case, something else. You know, you have Jonathan for the first time realizing his mom is not crazy, which is a relief, you know, in one way, but also terrifying in another way, because here's this other person that he knows is in possession of all of her marbles saying it was like he didn't have a face. You also have Hopper. I don't think he's quite prepared to accept monsters yet, but he definitely knows that there is, in title case, something else going on. And also with the kids. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's very, very much a turning point in the season, which makes sense because it's the halfway mark. So it's time to start ramping up the tension and everything.
Yeah, turning point. It's a really good way to put it. But in general, this is a really killer episode, and I think it's a little underappreciated even by myself.
Yeah.
So let's get into it. production shoutouts as usual. So this episode was again directed by Sean Levy. The writers this time were Justin Doble, who was also a co-producer on this and the last episode. This episode was also written by Jesse Nixon Lopez, the staff writer, same as episodes 2 and 3, and the Duffer Brothers. The DP was again Todd Campbell, and the editor here was Dean Zimmerman. He edited chapter 1. The costume design was Kimberly Adams Galligan and Malgosia Terzanska. She has a long filmography, costume design credit for the rest of this season, and also apparently worked as a costume designer for The Green Knight, which I don't believe has been released yet as of this recording.
Tragically.
Yeah, because it looks fabulous. So moving into the episode breakdown itself, again, we stay with the last group scene at the end of the previous episode, with Joyce, with Hop, with Jonathan, as the news of what they discovered in the quarry is being related to Joyce. But I noticed on this episode that it begins with the Byers and Hopper. Then it switches to Mike and Elle. But after the series intro, the point of view goes back to the Byers, or goes back to Joyce. And I found this curious because they're mostly doing the same thing. Like, because normally they've stayed with the same group after the cold open that they were before the cold open. So why I think this is worth noting at all is because it shows me that they're making these slight alterations to even this formula that they have. You know, it makes it seamless enough that you can binge it and just keep going, while also adding just enough variation to keep you interested, to not feel repetitive or redundant.
If you have a formula that works and that, creates tension and moves the story forward, it would be very easy to just nestle into that formula and not deviate from it. Even if the plot itself doesn't necessarily become predictable, the experience that you watch it with would become predictable and, as you said, repetitive, making it bingeable, so making it cohesive and making it compelling, but also at the same time not making it formulaic. So switching things up like that, that's not something that I would ever be aware of, not being a filmmaker or a film editor myself. It's one of those things that you absorb as an audience member fully without realizing you're doing it.
I would be curious to know, like, how much of that was actually written to that timing and to that pacing, and how much of it was discovered in the edit.
Mhm.
The contrast of the way the house looks as compared to the end of the previous episode without the Christmas lights on and without this, like, it looks so cold and austere. And even with the lights being off, it almost had this like skeletal look to it.
Mhm.
It just almost upside down like. I mean, we haven't seen the upside down properly yet, but it kind of almost reminded me of that. Just the fact that the colors, temperature of the lights, it's so cold, and the walls are almost totally dark. It's messy. It seems messy, whereas before it seemed, even when the Demogorgon was coming through the wall, it had all these rich, warm tones. I want to almost say magical, despite the horror that was happening and how scared Joyce was. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful to look at. But this perspective shift, Joyce's point of view to Hopper's and essentially like the outside worlds, I just was really impressed just by those first few shots.
Yeah. During the scenes where the Demogorgon is coming through the wall, you have this monster invading a space that is home, that is safe, especially when you bring in the Christmas lights, because for people who celebrate Christmas, there's a strong current of nostalgia that runs through that. Christmas lights and Christmas time is magical and, all of that. And so Joyce is kind of like obstinately trying to bring Will home through sheer force of will, and that is beautiful. It's beautiful on a ideological level as well as on a like set design level. And I think your point about the perspective shift is really important, because now we're not seeing Joyce's efforts to bring Will home. We're seeing Joyce's sort of coming apart at the seams. We know she's not. We know that her memory is correct. But just looking at the messiness of it, and I appreciate the messiness of it, because they're going through something that's unimaginable. And also there's like the visual language of the messy space is reflective of everyone's messy emotions.
Well, and even too, like, mostly all that I meant by messy was like, I love all of that. But the curious thing was I actually just meant that it seems messy. The lights themselves just
Yeah.
seem now they just seem like mess and chaos, these tangled webs. Hopper telling her what their theory is, there's a bit of the tiredness to his response to what she's saying, but he also seems patient, and that shifts. He notices when Jonathan walks away and how it seems like that's when he pivots from being a little bit more on the exasperated side to being patient, to see maybe that he's seeing like how that's affecting Jonathan too, and he doesn't sound condescending. And then from a writing perspective, I really liked that when Joyce says that she needs him to believe her and she pleads with him for it, he doesn't commit either way, which I feel like would be a very easy way for the script to have gone, for it to be like, yeah, I believe you, I promise. Like, but that would be empty.
This is an insanely triggering moment for him for obvious reasons, because of the loss of his own child. But I think this is really a really, really good insight into the softer part of Hopper's character because, I mean, as he says, I saw Sarah, I heard Sarah. So he believes that she believes it. He just doesn't believe that what she's seeing and hearing is real.
Mhm.
So I think that it's heartbreaking for him to have her plead with him, I need you to believe me. I need you to believe me because, I'm sure that he wanted to believe that he was seeing and hearing his daughter. And I'm sure he understands how much Joyce wants to believe that she's seeing and hearing Will. He plays that beautifully. And that moment of like, I actually forgot that he spends the night outside the house
Mhm.
and when he goes back to his car, I was like, "Oh, man, I know he feels like he has to leave because, like, he's performed his job and he feels now that his job is done, but, like, she really needs somebody to stay." And when he stayed, I was like, "That's my hop." To stay, but to not let her know that he was staying, to just, like, be there just in case, you know?
Mhm. And just to again kind of circle back to Jonathan, he's like, I am at capacity. And especially because Hopper is there, that he retreats to his bedroom. I think he allows himself to do that because he's not the only person there. He's like, I can't handle this.
Yeah. And Hopper watches him walk away. He absorbs the impact of what is happening, but Joyce doesn't even turn her head. She doesn't even acknowledge that that has happened. And that's not from a place of not caring about Jonathan. I mean, we know how much Joyce cares about both of her children, but it's just an indication of where she's at. She cannot at any moment accept the possibility that Will is gone, because if she accepts the possibility that he's gone, then she might really lose him. And so she just can't.
Mhm. After Hopper leaves, Joyce goes and gets the axe, as we discussed before, and Jonathan, meanwhile, listens to his music, "Atmosphere" by Joy Division. I think in general, like, I'm realizing Joyce and Jonathan being separated by his bedroom door particularly stood out, just in that they're blocked and that from one another in this episode in particular, and that, like, he doesn't see that she is thinking about him, that she comes and stands there before she goes and gets the axe.
Yeah, just seeing him trying to do that, trying to create that kind of place for himself. And also like he was kind of like hugging himself and it's so sad and so vulnerable and also just such a tribute to how much, he loves Will.
Well, and knowing that he's probably still wrestling with guilt,
Mhm.
no, because he knows that he's gonna have to go back out into the world and bear the weight of all of it kind of on his own because of how he perceives Joyce to be responding.
Yeah.
After that, we witness this moment of the Wheelers, Ted and Karen, watching the news report about Will, and I found this kind of moving. They knew Will. He was their son, one of their son's best friends. This is separate even from Mike, that this little boy that they knew is now dead, and that must hurt for them too.
Very much so. I like that Ted cares about how Mike is feeling. Before we started recording, I was on my soapbox a little bit about how much I hate the way media portrays dads as not giving a shit about their kids. Stranger Things, unfortunately, falls into that trap a lot. But this was a nice moment for Ted to like be there, be present. He's like, do I talk to him? Do I not talk to him? And Karen's like, let's give him some space. Let's let him be in his emotions and he'll come to us when he's ready. And that's a very valid conversation to have.
Well, and also I think Karen's also been based on last episode, she's the one who was handling the brunt of it all. Like she was already talking with Nancy about Barb, she was helping there, and then she was the one who witnessed Mike coming in right after he found out.
Right.
So by him saying, "Should I go talk to Michael?" There's also kind of an implication there of like, if this is what we should do, I'll do it. Like I'm willing to do that. Like to me, it doesn't sound. He didn't say it like annoyed or whatever. He
Yeah.
sounded like he would go. He would do it. But yeah, I just thought this scene was moving. Speaking of Michael, we shift from there down to the Wheeler's basement where Elle is tinkering with the walkie-talkie while Mike, he's kind of making his feelings clear to her until Will's voice comes through the walkie-talkie and he is thus convinced that Elle wasn't lying and that Will is in fact alive. I remember feeling a great swell of relief that Elle was still there.
Yeah. I like that scene. Like, I sympathize with Mike. I think of course he's lashing out, but like, I think he's lashing out a little bit too much. And, I kind of think that it would be okay if Elle had been like, knock it off.
Mm-hmm.
But, she doesn't have enough language to tell him that she wasn't lying and she can't explain herself. But I like that she didn't lash back. She just like kept working until she finally found him. I also like Mike was very angry and he was lashing out, but he wasn't cruel. He was just stating like how hurt he was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he says like what you did sucks. You hurt me. You lied to me. You made me hope that he was alive when he wasn't. If Will was dead, that would all be quite true and quite fair. It hurts me to see him yell at her, especially since I know she's not lying, but I definitely don't think that he's like out of line or anything like that.
I would not have been upset if she'd been more frustrated because she holds up the walkie like very slowly, like almost reverently, where, like if she had expressed something like gotten the signal, stood up quickly and like almost like shoved it at him or something like that, like listen.
Yeah.
That I would have liked, but I'm really glad that she doesn't act aloof or like condescending, that she's like, this is the important thing. Me being right isn't what matters here.
Right.
The next thing we see, Karen comes into Mike's room in the morning and she tries to offer some bonding time, but Mike convinces her that he just wants to stay home and that she can leave him there alone. He'll be okay. And after she leaves, he immediately jumps up and contacts Lucas.
Mm-hmm.
And his adorable way of going, Lucas, 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 Lucas.
Pestered the shit out of him, which is, how friends behave.
Something else from a production design and art direction perspective, we've spent a lot of time in Will and Mike's rooms at this point. And we've seen that like Mike has the Dark Crystal poster on his wall. There's the posters in the basement, and in Will's room he has the Jaws poster, But I thought it was interesting that Lucas, who is the most pragmatic, he's the most practical, he's the most logical of the four of them. There's an American flag above his bed and actual photos are on his wall. Two photos framed photos that I couldn't tell what they're of. They look like kind of like landscapes. I didn't see any posters, any movie posters or anything like fantastical. I just thought it was an interesting background touch just to, it says a lot, I think, about their personalities, that it adds to this idea that he's a little bit more, and I don't mean this as a good or bad thing, but just that he's a little more grounded than the others.
Yeah, it's kind of a bummer that he doesn't have like anything that's like personal or like kid-like,
He's got like stuff like on his desk, I think. I didn't pay as much attention to that, but I mean, we know that he has action figures, at least as of season 2, because Erica steals his He-Man figure. So we know that he's got like at least a He-Man action figure. So that makes me think, well, obviously he plays D&D with them and whatnot. So from there, we go with Joyce and Jonathan to the coroner's office. Joyce asks to see the birthmark. People discuss this point a lot to the question of is she actually asking about a real birthmark, or is it something she makes up as a test? I don't know that I have an opinion either way. I don't know that I have a theory. What do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I will share this is a very strange story that a friend of my family went through. This woman had a son who was at the time about 22 years old. A friend of her son got into a car accident and died. The cops called her because he had their home address and phone number in his pocket. Now I don't know why. I don't know if she ever knew why. But so the cops called her and told her that her son had died in this car accident because they thought it was her son and had her come in to identify the body. I mean, she was frantic, and this was before the era of cell phones, so she wasn't able to
Mm.
get a hold of him. Like, as far as she knew, she was actually going in to identify her son's body, which is unfathomable. They pulled the sheet back and she was like, "No, that's not my son." And of course, they were like, "No, come on. What do you mean this is not him?" And you know, because he didn't have his own license on him, or I don't know. So finally she said, my son wouldn't be caught dead in that outfit. Because this kid, you know, dressed differently than her son. But just like what a mind fuck, you know. So I mean her son was absolutely fine, although, you know, sadly his friend was not.
Mhm.
And so anyway, my interpretation of that scene, or my read of that scene, is the birthmark was somewhere like on his upper arm, somewhere that would not be necessarily visible. They made the body. I'm sure they had access to Will's, you know, medical records or whatever, but probably it was something that was small and subtle enough that it wouldn't have been like listed on a form or anything. So I just kind of thought like the birthmark wasn't there. It's real, but they didn't add it because they didn't know it was there. So as soon as she was like, didn't see the birthmark, she was like, "That's not my kid."
I think one of the more common theories I've heard is that the birthmark is real and it is there, but she's still just like, it's not my son. And of course, she's right. And then after she asks about the birthmark, we cut back to the waiting room between Hopper and Jonathan. Hopper asks him some questions and he basically prompts Jonathan into like to opening up a little bit. And I like that Jonathan kind of almost slips into letting out some of his concerns, but then he kind of talks himself back out of them in a way that made me think this is commonplace. He has to do this all the time because he bears so much of the responsibility knowing that she does have anxiety problems and that this is just an extreme version of something that they've gone through before. But then Hopper kind of helps him out. I really liked that moment between the two of them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was thinking very much along the same lines that like, you know, Jonathan is just a kid. He really needs somebody to talk to. And Hopper is good at drawing people out, making people feel like they can talk to him. So he draws Jonathan out, and then all of a sudden there's this kind of like, you know, coin flip of Jonathan looking over at Hopper and being like, "Oh fuck, I'm talking to a cop," you know?
Mhm.
And Hopper is worthy of Jonathan's trust, but Jonathan doesn't know that. So he deflects and is like, "Oh no, you know, my mom's tough. She's fine. She's fine." And Hopper sees right through him. And instead of being like, "You can talk to me, son," which would have the exact opposite of the intended effect, he validates Jonathan and says, "Yeah, she's going to be okay. She's tough."
Mhm.
And does the whole like father figure shoulder pat thing, which is good. It's
Yeah.
good. It's a good moment for both of them.
I think it's moments like this that really make season 1 sing the way that it does.
And I love that Hopper asking about the whole state guys coming in and like getting rid of the regular autopsy guy. I love the way that he just like casually asks questions. He's like, "Without Gary."
Mhm.
And then just kind of like letting Jonathan talk to him. And you can see Hopper taking in all of these like disparate facts and just kind of like letting them exist and not like judging them one way or judging them another way. He's just kind of like looking at all of this and saying, huh. And I also like that, like, Jonathan is the one to go after Joyce when she bursts out of the morgue and refuses to sign the form, and not Hopper. Like, he doesn't go after her and try to force her to sign the thing, because that would have been, I would not have liked that.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, as a cop, yeah, that's probably kind of the expectation. So, good on Hop.
I think this is one of the first big demonstrations of it would have been very easy to go straight from Joyce bursting out and leaving and Jonathan following her to going straight into their argument afterwards. But I like that it's intercut with this scene in the alley of the high school between Nancy and Steve, because you get this kind of fascinating parallel between Nancy and Joyce both being having this conviction in there's something else going on here and you're not concerned about it. Because again, they could have just very easily done the stuff with Jonathan and Joyce all in one go. But to cut back to Nancy and Steve, it's definitely a choice to do that. It's not casual. It's definitely intentional, I think. Like, it adds another layer of how the story is being told that I thought it's starting to blend the groups a little bit in ways that I don't think we've seen yet.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And I think that's an interesting parallel. And I like that it's women. It's Elle saying, no, Will is alive. It's Joyce saying, no, Will is alive, for the most part.
Well, I would think, I mean, maybe what we've just done is we've hit on kind of the theme of the episode, which is, or at least one of the themes, which is, someone, the idea of having conviction and a belief and then getting other people on board. The expectations between people that we trust and whether or not they get on board or not, because then what happens in the kids group, as we see in a couple of scenes down the line here, Elle has convinced Mike, and then Mike then has the conversation with Dustin and Lucas, and then eventually they get on board. So it's like this kind of slow burn of the truth starts to kind of ooze out of the ground, like, and everyone essentially gets affected by it. But
yeah.
So in that scene with Nancy and Steve in the alley, Steve's only scene, the note that I wrote for myself here was "guy with no face!" exclamation point. First piece of the puzzle starting to connect. And I would also say that this is one of the earlier moments of Nancy starting to show a little bit of the characterization that we're going to see her develop into over the course of the series. Nancy is someone that I think falls a lot between, or falls kind of some like pretty squarely in the middle between like Elle, who just evolves and grows and is so consistent, the way we talked about that in chapter 1, whereas Steve like is this complete, like, just completely changes. And I think Nancy is a really great example of a character that changes a lot but also stays very consistent at the same time. And I think this is one of the earlier sort of glimmers of this investigative, take no bullshit moments where she's just like, I can't believe you right now. I don't have time. Like, we saw a little bit of that concern last episode, but last episode I think she was a little less direct.
Yeah. I also really love the contrast between Steve frankly not giving a shit about Barb, and later when Nancy and Jonathan are looking at that picture, one of the first things that Nancy says is that Will is alive, and the first thing that Jonathan says is that Barbara must be alive. So it really makes sense that Nancy is, finding solace in this budding friendship, for want of a better term, with Jonathan, because he is validating the things that are important to her, even as he's going through something really, really terrible himself. They get each other in a way that Steve and Nancy don't.
And yeah, so we pivot away from the scene in the alley back to Jonathan and Joyce in a very public place, and they proceed to have a pretty awful fight.
Yeah.
The scene is really hard to watch. It always has been. I love how much we as the audience feel both sides of this argument. We completely understand both perspectives.
Yeah. It's very much a situation of they're both right, and neither of them is able to acknowledge that the other is also right. And I think they're both heartbroken by how far separated they are from one another in this moment.
They see the situation very differently, but they both ultimately want to do right by Will and his life. The only thing that kind of bothers me a little bit on this rewatch is I guess it just makes me sad is that he's crying in front of her. And it's almost goes back to your observation from the opening sequence of how she doesn't notice him leave. She can't see how hard this is on her other child who is in front of her. It just
Yeah.
really breaks my heart. She doesn't see him as much as she used to as as a child because he's had to be such an adult for so long. But he is just a 17-year-old kid.
Yeah.
You know, she's yelling in the same way that she would at Hopper. And I think that this time hit a couple of my buttons. You know, I love Joyce. I will always love Joyce, but yeah, that sat a little bit more uncomfortably on me than it has in the past.
Well, and that's what I mean by she is unraveling. She's
Mhm.
not okay. Joyce is not choosing to behave like this. If she was doing absolutely fine and, like there was some kind of argument going on between her and Jonathan and Will was home and, everything was great, this would not be how she would talk to Jonathan. I mean, there might be shades of this because this is a situation where existing fault lines within relationships get blown up. But it wouldn't be like this. She would not yell at Jonathan in the street while he was crying like this. That just doesn't strike me as something that Joyce would do.
Mhm.
And Jonathan wouldn't yell at Joyce like that in the street. Up to this point, he's been so very like, okay, mom, we got to do, like, even when he gets frustrated, it's so much like, I need you to take care of yourself. I need you to sleep. I need you to eat something,
Mhm.
not like yelling at her.
Yeah, because even when he's like, first the lights, now the wall," like, "Can you please try to get some," like, yeah, like, he's always the one who de-escalates, but this time he just doesn't have it in him.
Right. They're both past their breaking point, and that's what makes it so sad. I don't think that either of them is handling this situation the quote unquote right way, but, I don't blame either of them.
After that, we shift back to the kids and the debate over whether or not Will is alive, and ultimately they decide that they need to get Elle to the Heath kit so that they can magnify her power because the walkie-talkie is just not powerful enough. They need a stronger source, but that means they have to go to school, and that means they need to give her a makeover first. How do we feel about the makeover?
I think it's adorable, not least because they don't know what the hell they're doing, you know?
Yeah.
And I mean, I think she looks ridiculous, but adorable
Yeah.
in that outfit.
One I like too because it's not about making her look better, you know? It's just to help her
Yeah.
blend in, which
Which she absolutely does not with those,
yeah.
like, socks and that dress.
You know, and the sort of wow response is unexpected and
Yeah.
unpredicted. Like, they're not expecting to be, like, wowed, they're trying to make her look, you know, quote unquote "normal." So, although I have to say the she looks pretty good. It's a little clunky, you know, but I like it anyway. And, I don't know if you noticed, but I love not only Lucas's WTF face behind Mike,
Yeah.
but Dustin behind Lucas grinning at both of them.
I don't think I ever noticed Lucas's WTF face until this watch, and I was just like, "Oh my god."
Yeah. And then it's sweet that Elle looks happy at Mike's response, but her real wow moment is when she sees herself.
Mhm.
As a very high contrast to that, the episode shifts to the Hawkins Lab, and we see the start of the field walk. They get that started before cutting back to the high school, where Nancy is pulled out of class to be questioned by Powell and Callahan.
I don't like anything about this scene. I really don't understand why these cops that we have been led to feel sympathetically about are now being brought in to be like officer patriarchy and officer slut shame. I hate all of it. I really fucking hate all of it.
Trying to establish a motive for why Barb might have run away. I get that, but the way that they go about it is just it's completely uncalled for. I don't know. I don't know why this scene had to be written in this way, because what happened could have come out to get them to discuss it without having it be what it is. Before or after you took off your clothes. Like, it, it's unreal that, what does that have to do with Barb? That has nothing to do with what they're there for, which is to investigate Barb's disappearance. Callahan has been an idiot pretty much from jump, but Powell's been not as bad, and I actually like Powell in pretty much every other scene that he's in. He's definitely the next most competent after Hopper. Because remember back in I think it's chapter 1, Hopper says Joyce is, about one step from falling off the edge, and Powell says, well, she's been quite a few steps for a while, right? And he's like, hey, her kid's missing, have a little respect. And he walks away, and then Callahan's the one that says, Joyce and him, they used to screw, right? And Powell just looks at him like, really?
Mhm.
And then keeps walking and goes back to going like, well, and Powell, and then that's when Callahan is like, did I, yeah? Or, so to me, that at least would have tracked a little.
Yeah. Taking any opportunity to be shitty to a woman because of her sexual choices. That's just, it wasn't necessary.
Well, and especially when Nancy says, like, it wasn't like that. She's setting a boundary there, and then they just double down on it. It's like, what?
Why?
Yeah.
Why? I wish that it had been the state cops, the, air quotes state cops. Like, it would make sense that people who were hired by the lab were being sent in to shut down the investigation, and that they would be really brutal and gross about it.
So before we can see, though, the follow-up to this between Nancy and Karen, we have a couple other scenes. First among them being Hop talks to Gary from the coroner's office. Mark Withers is his name, and Stranger Things season 1 has had this streak of casting really good actors in these smaller roles that only appear once, sometimes twice. Because I remember that back in episode 2, I said how much I really liked the actress Bethany Ann Lind, who played that small role of the woman who was staying over at Hopper's,
Mhm.
and how well that scene worked, largely because of the two of them together. And then I don't think I actually mentioned it in our recording, but I really liked the actor Miles Mussenden, who played Patrick, the officer at Hawkins Lab that Hopper convinces to let him in. Like, I remember him, and he appears once. We never see him again.
Yeah.
But yeah, I liked this guy playing Gary. I thought he was good.
Yeah, he was cool. And I liked the way that, again, Hopper was just like, this is not an interrogation. We're just two buds, just chatting about stuff and so on. And, but again, you can like see his mind working as he's like gathering all of this information.
Mhm. Back with our quartet of kids, the boys bike with Elle to school in an attempt to get to the Heathkit, and they get intercepted and have to improvise an entire backstory for Elle in a matter of moments.
It's all that D&D paying off.
Yep, I was just thinking that. I feel like it's hokey and pretty unbelievable. Like, she clearly says 11,
Mhm.
but I feel like Mr. Clark probably knows that it's BS. He knows they're lying, but he isn't worried enough to try to, like, pressure them into giving him the truth.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always laugh hysterically at Dustin's Sub-Zero.
Yeah.
We switch back over to Nancy and Karen.
I think it's really just a consistent follow-up to the scene that I already liked so much between Nancy and Karen. It's very, very believable. When it comes to teenagers having sex, there's, a level of concern about like safety. And I also feel like Karen is just kind of worried about her, for all of those kind of like practical reasons. And also there's a little bit of like moral panic. I think it could very easily be read as she's judging or condemning Nancy, but I don't think she is. By the end of that scene, she gets to the point of realizing that Nancy's right. Her and Steve sleeping together is not the point. Barb is missing. That's the point. And so when Nancy is like, nobody is listening to me, nobody will pay attention to what's really going on here. I really do think that it clicks for Karen that Nancy's right. And then she tries to reach out and says, I'm listening. I know. I hear you. And then Nancy has a very understandable reaction of, no, you're not.
Mhm.
So again, it's just a thing where I really, really feel for both of them. Karen is like going through it,
Mhm.
trying to be there for both of her kids, trying to figure out what's going on. Things are changing. Nancy's growing up, but she really is making an effort and she really is trying.
And then that, of course, is followed by Nancy going into her bedroom and she pieces the photo together. Nancy's looking at the Demogorgon more or less, and that's when we cut back to the lab for the second half of this field walk that ends badly. I think it starts to instill a sense of like, "Oh, you don't know what you're getting into," kind of thing, because this fully grown man in this hazmat suit with all this support around him walks into this thing and doesn't come out again.
I definitely got the impression that he was some sort of like special forces military look upon me and tremble for I am a badass kind of guy, you know?
Yeah. Although there is a moment in that sequence where he looks up at Brenner, and it was interesting because I was like, "That's kind of interesting." Like, I know like, he's not scared of Brenner the way that 11 is, but it felt a little similar, like, Brenner's the one in charge in this moment. Just the simplicity of this, it's such an example of less is more. The stakes feel so high. You're in this room full of guys, they don't know what they're doing. The lack of hearing anything back is scary enough, and then to have the reel retracting so slowly and then getting whipped around, and it's just I don't think it's referencing Jaws, but it's that same idea of it's what we're not seeing. The gate is so small that it's not this big monstrous thing, it's this little tiny entrance, and yet such a disastrous result.
Mhm.
Back over at Hawkins Middle, kids attend the assembly. Elle calls Troy a mouth breather.
Mhm. Yeah, I loved that. She just, like, immediately copped to the fact that, this is the guy that's causing Mike problems, and Elle is able to identify a bully very easily.
Mhm. Then after Mike picks the fight with Troy, like, I just wonder if maybe, like, part of the reason she just so quickly comes to his defense is because this is nothing for her.
Yeah. Is he humiliated? Yes. Is he permanently damaged by this experience physically? No, not at all. She just took away his power.
And he doesn't as we find out, I think next episode? Yeah, he doesn't like that.
No, no, he does not.
Mm-mm. Meanwhile, while Jonathan shops for coffins, he's interrupted by when Nancy shows up to ask him about the photos. More puzzle pieces clicking into place.
I really like all of the conversations between Jonathan and Nancy in this episode, which, like, given how much and how loudly and how repeatedly I had to say about things last time, is kind of a surprise, but I did really like it. The only thing is, yeah, I felt weird and not great about her interrupting him shopping for a coffin for his brother to be like, look at this picture. Yeah, it felt a little insensitive.
Yeah, I mean, she tries to kinda go, "I shouldn't have come today."
Yeah.
But yeah, I would agree with that. I also think too that them both talking about the photo very objectively, I totally buy that because I don't think either of them would want to address the elephant in the room. I mean, he even says, "I wasn't using the wide angle." Like, it's, while I was taking pictures of you taking your clothes off. Like, they don't address it, but I totally buy it. It's very believable to me.
Yeah.
There's a nice musical transition there. I liked the way the score transitions from, "How did you know that?" into the next sequence, which is Hopper going to the bar and almost kind of going, like, quasi undercover and talking to I believe that this guy is supposed to be State Trooper O'Bannon. Because yeah, another good, really well-cast small role. When the scene cuts to Hopper beating him up in the alley, it's like, "Oh, shit." Like, it's like, "Well, that escalated quickly." Like, "Woo, okay." If it's not the first, it's definitely one of the first times we've seen him be this brutal with someone. It's a harsh transition in a good way.
Yeah.
It's like, "Oh, he's invested now."
Mhm.
And I feel bad for this guy, for O'Bannon, because we never see him again, so I have a bad feeling about his prospects, his chances. The lab won't, do something, but I hope that he's still around.
Oh my god, you are so nice. I'm just like, I don't care.
Well, I get the impression that like they probably threatened him in some capacity, or at least gave him some reason to call it in and not question, but I don't think he needed to die for it. I just, it just makes me I just worry for him. So, and I feel like the entire vibe of this scene, like I feel like other shows might have tried to make this feel like super political spy thrillery. And even though you do have a little bit of that, it because you're in the vibe of the supernatural as well, it doesn't feel like it's trying to do that and failing. It just still feels like, no, this is just a little small town.
Mhm.
There is something bigger going on, but it's not. It works for me, I guess, is what I'm saying. We ping back to Joyce, who's playing the Clash to try to get back into connection with Will, and then that's intercut with the kids getting to the Heath kit, which leads into a flashback. Brenner giving Elle the task to find this guy. He wants her to testing her powers was what I got from it. And Elle's very quiet hurt him tells us so much.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it made me think that this could explain a lot of why her concept of like life and death and inflicting pain on others is so skewed, or that it might be skewed at the very least. And followed by his thing about, no, I just want you to find him, like those old nursery rhymes, like we used to, you know, that that made me feel even more squick because that implies this like twisted sense of loyalty and family, and
Mhm.
it's just gross. It's one line and it conveys all of that.
Yeah. And the way that he was using affection and touch to, like, manipulate her when he, like, pats her hand and when he talks about the nursery rhymes, and then he, like, puts his hand kinda, like, behind her neck and, like, pushes her forward
Yep.
was, like, really, ugh, I mean, great acting,
Yeah.
great blocking, but super gross.
Yeah, the possessiveness of it. It's just ugh. Kind of like with last episode when he put his hands around her head,
Mhm.
the way that too that the camera pans back down to Elle, I think that's broadcasting to us not only how powerful she is, but also how creative she is.
Mhm.
And then we snap back to the present with Elle channeling Will, and then that's intercut so beautifully with Will and Joyce.
Yeah.
This is like more puzzle pieces clicking into place. Dustin and Lucas are now both like, holy shit, he's alive. And they hear Joyce too, right?
No, they don't. That was something that I was paying attention to. I don't think they do hear Joyce because
Okay.
they can only hear Will.
Okay. Her getting the axe and chopping the wall. So badass. We've seen Joyce sort of yo-yo back and forth this episode between tears and being angry, and we've seen like downtrodden and weak. And this is just a moment of like, bitch, I'm coming for you.
Yeah,
you know, like
absolutely. Yeah, this is one of my favorite Joyce moments in the whole season and really in the whole series. Again, like I've sung the praises before of Joyce just not giving a shit. And I absolutely love it.
yep. We fling back over to Nancy and Jonathan in the dark room. And in this scene, they discuss basically the Demogorgon, Jonathan's photography, and then they put a plan together. I was curious to know what you thought, though, of how Nancy very casually asks about what she was saying when he took her picture.
Yeah. Uh, mm, I don't like it because of the context.
And Jonathan openly says, I shouldn't have done that, and then apologizes outright,
Mhm.
which I like a lot. Because I had forgotten that he actually says, I'm sorry, that he actually does apologize. I thought he just said I shouldn't have taken that. But she barely even notices.
Yeah.
Because they didn't address it in the last scene in a way that worked. But I think if they're gonna address it here, then it would have been nice if they had actually resolved the issue here. But at least from this point forward, I don't think it comes up again.
At least we're past it.
Yeah, exactly. Hopper returns to the coroner's office and basically goes ahead and investigates Will's body. And I'm going to repeat something I said last episode, which is I love clever, sneaky Hopper.
Me too.
Leaving his hat in the truck and then forgot my hat.
Mhm.
Even though I didn't find the show overall particularly, at least not too scary the first time that I watched it through, when Hopper goes in and cuts open what turns out to be a dummy of Will's body. I just...
Yeah. Everything about that scene is just masterful. Like, I love the way that, like, he punches the dude. He's just like, okay. Like, punches the guy.
Mhm.
And then transitions very, very quickly from this kind of like, I'm a badass moment to, really kind of confronting, again, a very triggering thing for him, which is like looking at the body of a dead child. The look on his face when he reaches out and just like touches Will's skin. Now we know it's not Will. And then he like pulls his hand back.
Mhm.
The look on his face when he like opens his knife and like all of it. Like Harbor's acting in that scene is just fantastic.
I mean, to me, it also shows how committed Hopper is to this because,
Yeah.
in addition to all of the emotional triggers that you've mentioned, I mean, the ramifications if he gets caught. Because he punches the guy out, but it's like, how long will that guy stay out?
Mm-hmm.
When he comes to, even if Hopper's long gone, he knew that Hopper was there. So did the secretary. What if the cop does come too early and comes in there? And no matter what, the body, the quote body, has now been tampered with, and that could come back to him. And the lab is already onto him in theory. So yeah, it's a really bold move on Hopper's part, and it shows like how dedicated he is to this. And I wondered if maybe this is also how, at least maybe contributes, if nothing else, to how Joyce knew that the body didn't, fake body is filled with cotton, not being the right like weight, somehow that translated, or maybe she somehow just could tell that it wasn't her son. In conclusion of the episode, we cut back to Joyce because, of course, I mean, several alarm bells are going off in Hopper's head, but one of them has got to be, "You were right."
Yeah.
I think that's partly what makes the transition back to Joyce so clever, because we cut back to Joyce and Lonnie has arrived. I was fooled by Lonnie in a lot of ways when I first watched this season, enough that when he showed up here and the way Joyce reaches for him, it just kind of made me wonder again about their history and like, wow, I did not expect to see you.
Yeah, I'm really suspicious of Lonnie just in general and like have always been. So like when he gets out of the car and says, "Babe," I'm like, "Are you fucking kidding me?"
Mhm.
But I am glad that he's at least there to like give her a hug.
Yeah, I mean, because I think I was leaning towards hoping that he wasn't the despicable human being that he turns out to be. I guess it left me wondering, okay, this was an interesting move. Where do we go from here? And I think in some ways I was almost more intrigued by that than the final beat of the episode, which, don't get me wrong, I was very intrigued by this too. Hopper going to the lab.
Mhm.
Such stark contrast to the last episode, to chapter 3, which was very conclusive. There was a lot of like feeling of finality in a good way to that episode. This one is like got so many loose threads.
Yeah, it's very much a thing of like, let's keep going,
To bookend what we talked about at the beginning, it does a nice job of not repeating itself.
Mhm.
Overall thoughts for this episode, to reiterate where we started, it's such a big episode in terms of like information is revealed. It's very character driven, and again, to, as you said, turning point in this series as a whole. I really enjoyed this episode. More than I thought that I would. I feel like overall, like, we walked away from chapter 3 with a lot more negative stuff to say, and I feel like this was a nice contrast in the broad strokes to have a lot. I feel like the positives outweighed the negatives this time around, so I was happy about that.
It reminds me a little bit of, while acknowledging that we don't like the author anymore, it reminds me of kind of like the tonal shift that happens in Goblet of Fire. That's very much a pivotal point in the Harry Potter series where Voldemort comes back. Everything up to then had already been quite serious, but that was really the sea change. And that feels true of this episode as well.
Yeah, that's a really good parallel. So, yeah, thank you everybody for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode and this new approach, this chronological breakdowns instead of group by group. So, until next time, Over and out.
Pour one out for season 1 Hopper that was capable of subtlety. Sorry, that was very snarky.
I like it. If I edit this episode, I'm leaving that in.